thought it was just another Christmas Eve. The fire crackling, the tree lights twinkling, and my family gathered around. But then the knocking began. At first, I thought it was just a prank, but the growls that followed, those were real, and they weren't human. As the door creaked open, the shadow that stood in the doorway wasn't Santa Claus. It was something far worse, something far older, and it was here for me. This is the true story of the night Krampus came knocking. It was Christmas Eve, 2017, and I was staying at my cousin's cabin in the mountains, miles away from the nearest town. The air was cold, crisp, the kind that stings your lungs when you breathe too deep. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace made everything feel cozy. Too cozy, if I'm being honest. But my cousin Anna loved Christmas, and so did her family. They made a big deal out of it, and I didn't mind. But that year, I had a bad feeling. Something I couldn't shake. We had just finished dinner, and the kids were playing with their gifts in the next room. The adults were sitting around the fire, laughing and drinking wine. I was on the couch, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. That's when it happened. A knock. Not a normal knock, but a thundering bang that rattled the windows. At first, everyone froze. "Who's out there?" Anna's husband, Dave, muttered, standing up. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to sound calm. But my voice wavered. The knock came again, louder this time. Dave hesitated. "I'll check." I watched as he walked to the door, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. The rest of us stayed silent, the room too still. It was as if the whole world had stopped. When Dave opened the door, there was nothing, just snow falling in thick, heavy flakes. A deep silence outside, like the world had been swallowed whole. But then I saw it, something huge, just beyond the threshold. Huge horns rising from the snow. A dark figure, towering, with glowing eyes. Dave slammed the door shut, so hard the walls shook. His face went pale. He stumbled back, muttering something under his breath. "It's him," he whispered. "Krampus." Anna's voice quivered. "What are you talking about, Dave? It's just a prank, right?" But Dave was already moving, rushing to the windows. I followed him, but when I looked outside, I saw nothing. No sign of the figure, no tracks in the snow. It was like it had never been there, but I felt it. The air had changed. It was colder. The sound of the wind seemed wrong, almost unnatural. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door again, this time from the back of the house. The heavy wooden door rattled, as though something large was pounding against it with its fists. "Get the kids inside now," Dave shouted, his voice shaking. But it was too late. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped drastically, like someone had thrown open a door to the Arctic. A guttural growl echoed through the house. It wasn't an animal. It was something worse. My heart raced as I saw the shadow of something large moving past the windows. It was too tall to be human, and the shape, the horns, the long claws scraping against the walls outside. I knew, deep down, we weren't dealing with any prank. This was something older, something darker. Krampus, the Christmas demon. Then the door burst open, with such force it splintered. The beast stepped into the room. I've never seen anything like it in my life. Its eyes were glowing yellow, its teeth sharp as daggers. It was covered in black, matted fur, and its massive claws clicked against the floor with every step. The stench was unbearable, rotting flesh and sulfur. Panic erupted. The children screamed as they scattered, hiding under tables, in closets, anywhere they could. My cousin Anna screamed at us to run. I ran, not knowing where to go, but I could hear it, its growl getting closer. We tried to escape, but the door wouldn't open. It had been sealed shut somehow, as if the very walls of the cabin had conspired to trap us inside. I turned to see the creature at the top of the stairs. It was coming for us. Its voice, like gravel scraping against stone, echoed through the cabin. "You've been naughty," it hissed, its breath hot and putrid. "You will pay." I looked at Dave, who was frozen, too terrified to move. He'd seen this before, he told me later, but he never thought it would come for him. "Krampus," he whispered, barely able to breathe. I didn't believe it. I thought it was just a story, but it's real. Then I saw it, the sack hanging from the demon's back. A massive burlap sack, large enough to carry a person. I knew what it meant. It was here to collect the bad. The growl grew louder. Krampus was closer now, and we had nowhere to hide. The kids were sobbing, clinging to their parents. I ran toward the back door, but as soon as I touched the handle, I felt something cold wrap around my wrist. The claws. It dragged me back. The world spun. That was the last thing I remembered before I passed out. I woke up hours later, lying in the snow. The moon was high in the sky, and everything was silent. The house was gone, not just destroyed, completely vanished, as if it had never been there at all. No trace, nothing. I was alone. I tried calling my family, but my phone was dead. When I returned to town, no one believed me. They thought I was insane, just another crazy person with a Christmas story. But I know what I saw that night. Krampus is real, and it's still out there, watching, waiting for those who have been naughty to make them pay. And if you think you're safe, just remember, he's always watching. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, a night of joy. But the moment I saw him, dressed in a Santa suit, standing on the doorstep, my world turned to terror. He wasn't delivering gifts. He was delivering death. I tried to run, but he was already inside, and the screams of my family would haunt me forever. This is the true story of the Covina Christmas Massacre, a night where a killer dressed as Santa Claus turned a holiday gathering into a nightmare. Christmas 2008 was supposed to be like any other. I had planned to spend the evening with my family at my aunt and uncle's house in Covina, California. It was a typical gathering. My cousins, aunts, uncles, and their kids all gathered around, laughing, eating, and exchanging gifts. The tree was up, the lights twinkling, the whole house filled with warmth and joy. But as the night wore on, something felt off. I couldn't explain it at first, just a nagging sense of unease that I tried to push aside. Maybe it was the way the snowstorm outside seemed to intensify, or how the air inside felt heavier, colder than it should have been for December in Southern California. But I tried to ignore it. Everyone was so caught up in the festivities. Then, at around 11 p.m., the knock came. It was a loud, forceful knock on the front door. At first, we all froze. Who could be visiting at this hour in the middle of a snowstorm? My uncle, ever the prankster, stood up to answer it. I remember the nervous chuckle he gave before opening the door, expecting some last-minute visitor, perhaps a neighbor or a carol singer. What we didn't expect was the sight of a man standing there, dressed as Santa Claus. The red suit, the white beard, the black boots. He looked like the real deal. but there was something wrong, something sinister in the way he stood. It wasn't until he spoke that I realized just how wrong it all was. "I'm here for the party," he said, his voice muffled beneath the thick layers of his costume. Uncle Joe, thinking it was some kind of Christmas joke, stepped back to let him in. "You're late, but come on in," he laughed. But as the door opened wider, that's when we all heard it. Footsteps, heavy footsteps, behind him. And then, without warning, the air shifted. A strange, cold chill swept over the room. The man dressed as Santa stepped inside, but he wasn't alone. He was carrying a large sack slung over his shoulder. At first, I thought it was a prop, a bag full of gifts for the kids. But as he turned, I saw it. A gun. It was tucked beneath his Santa suit, just under his arm. The moment I saw the barrel, my heart stopped. "Everyone on the ground," he screamed, his voice now raw and unhinged. It wasn't Santa anymore. It was something much darker. Pandemonium broke out. The kids screamed. The adults froze, not knowing what to do. My aunt grabbed me and pulled me behind the couch, her face pale and wide-eyed. The man, if you could still call him that, pulled the gun from his suit and began firing, first at Uncle Joe, then Aunt Barbara. There was no rhyme or reason to it, just cold, brutal violence. I couldn't believe my eyes. I crouched behind the couch, holding my breath, praying that somehow, some way, I wouldn't be next. The sound of gunfire echoed through the house, and my mind raced. Was he just trying to rob us? Had we done something to anger him? But it was too late to ask questions. The killer moved through the house like a phantom, each shot ringing out like the tolling of a bell. As the killer moved from room to room, I couldn't make sense of it. There was no negotiation, no demand for money. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. He was here for something else. But what? My heart raced as I heard the footsteps getting closer. I heard him pass by the living room, and then there was silence. I dared to peek around the corner of the couch. Through the hallway, I saw him, Santa, standing at the doorway of the kitchen. He was holding something in his hand, something that sent a chill down my spine, a fire extinguisher. He sprayed it into the air, and then I realized he was blocking off all exits. We were trapped. It was then that I saw the full horror of what he had done. Uncle Joe and Aunt Barbara lay motionless on the floor. But it wasn't just them. My cousins, the little ones, had been dragged into the kitchen, where they huddled, crying in terror, and I could see his face, no longer a man in a costume, but a creature full of rage. His eyes were wild, his mouth twisted into a deranged grin. "He's gone completely mad," I whispered to myself. The man had been living a lie for years. His name was Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, and he wasn't some stranger just crashing a Christmas party. He was a former family member, a man who had been married to my aunt's sister, Sylvia. They had divorced years ago under violent and bitter circumstances, and no one had heard from him in months. What we didn't know was that he had been planning this night for weeks. He had been preparing for the perfect Christmas massacre, and when he showed up at our doorstep in that Santa suit, he wasn't just bringing death, he was bringing revenge. Bruce had shown up with a plan to kill my entire family, then burn the house down to cover his tracks. The sack he carried wasn't full of gifts. It was filled with weapons, guns, explosives, everything he needed to finish what he had started. But after what felt like an eternity, after the shots had stopped and the fire had started, Bruce was gone. The sound of sirens filled the air as neighbors finally realized something was wrong. But it was too late. The house was engulfed in flames by the time the police arrived. Bruce had already fled into the night, leaving destruction in his wake. It started as any Christmas Eve would. Me, alone in my small apartment, trying to escape the chaos of life with a glass of wine and a classic Christmas movie. I was feeling the weight of everything. The failed relationships, the missed opportunities, the debt piling up from all the gifts I couldn't afford. I put on A Christmas Carol, thinking it would cheer me up. I'd seen it 100 times, but there was something comforting about watching Scrooge get visited by the ghosts of Christmas. But as I sat back, I started to feel it. That unease, a creeping cold that seemed to seep into the room, despite the warmth from the fire. I tried to brush it off, blaming it on the drafty windows, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just the weather. There was something else, something wrong. The first knock on the door was light, barely audible. At first, I thought it was just a sound from the movie, but then it came again, louder this time. Someone was definitely at my door. I hesitated, looking through the peephole, but there was no one there. A chill ran down my spine. The knocking came again, persistent and demanding. I opened the door, but the hallway was empty. No one in sight, just darkness. The light from my apartment seemed to dim as the door swung wide. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me. That was when I noticed it. The smell. It was faint at first, like rotting meat, mixed with something metallic, like old pennies. My stomach churned, and I felt a sudden rush of nausea. What the hell was going on? I turned to sit back down, but the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the apartment, just behind me, where the shadows seemed to linger unnaturally close to the walls. I stood frozen, my heart racing. That's when I heard it, low at first, like a whisper, but growing louder with each passing second. A voice. Scrooge. Scrooge. I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice wasn't from the TV. It was real, coming from the darkness itself. A cold shiver ran through my bones as I backed away from the shadows. Scrooge, come to me. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. This wasn't happening. But then I saw it. A shape, emerging slowly from the darkness. A figure, tall, cloaked. And as it moved into the light, I saw the face. Pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed too deep, too hollow. It wasn't a person. It was something. Ancient. Something beyond human. The ghost of Christmas past, I thought. But this wasn't the ghost from the movie. This wasn't the warm, soft-spoken spirit who gently led Scrooge on his journey. This was something darker. Something far more malevolent. Do you remember Scrooge? The ghost asked, its voice low and guttural, like it had come from the depths of the earth. Do you remember what you've done? The air grew colder. The fire in the hearth flickered and died, leaving only the dim light from the tree's decorations. I could feel my breath turning to mist as the ghost stepped closer, its form shifting, flickering like a candle in the wind. You think you're safe, it hissed. You think you're immune, but you've made your choices, Scrooge, and now you will pay. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed by the presence of this thing. It wasn't just a ghost. It was an entity, and it was here for me. The room began to distort, the walls closing in as the ghost reached out. its cold, skeletal hand brushing my face. It felt like ice against my skin, like death itself was touching me. You're the one who abandoned them, Scrooge. The ones you loved. The ones you hurt. Suddenly, the walls around me vanished, replaced by scenes, visions. I was back in my childhood home, watching myself as a little boy. My parents were sitting at the dinner table, laughing, but I could see the sorrow in my younger self's eyes. I could feel the neglect, the distance. They were always busy with work, always telling me to be quiet, to go away. The scene shifted again, this time to a woman I had once loved, now standing in the rain, her face a mixture of pain and regret. I had pushed her away, told her I didn't need her, but now I could see it. I could feel it. The love I had lost, the life I had destroyed. You left them all, Scrooge, the ghost whispered, its voice growing darker. You left them to die, alone. The world around me twisted again, and suddenly I was standing in a graveyard, looking down at a tombstone with my own name carved into it. The wind howled, and I could feel the earth beneath my feet shaking, as if it was ready to swallow me whole. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, growing closer, and when I turned, I saw him. My father standing in the distance, his face hollow with anger and betrayal. You'll never escape, Scrooge, the ghost said, its form now flickering like a candle on the verge of going out. You'll never escape the consequences of your choices, not in this life and not in the next. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to escape. The terror, the guilt, it was too much. I turned, my legs moving on their own, running through the distorted images, through the endless corridors of memory and regret. But the ghost followed, always just behind me. I reached the door, threw it open, and stumbled outside into the cold night. The snow had begun to fall, but the world outside wasn't any better. I could still hear the whispers, feel the presence of the ghost closing in. I ran until my breath was ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. But no matter how far I went, no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the truth. The ghost was still there, still following me, waiting for me to face the consequences of my actions. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A shadow, looming in the doorway of a house, its eyes glowing, waiting for me to return.